afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the World Book Day Book Bazaar live stream. Today, we are pleased to invite Mr. Tsafar Anjum of Kitaab International to introduce and launch Kitaab International's new titles. Let's welcome Mr. Tsafar Anjum.
Hello and good afternoon from Singapore. Welcome to this special live cast of the launch of Why Now by Neil Daswani. Today is International Labour Day, and this is definitely a labour of love, and Neil will talk about it more in detail. My name is Zafar Anjum. I am the publisher of Kitaab, and next to me is the author himself, poet Neil Daswani.
Thank you.
And we are very lucky to have Dr. Chris Moonising with us, who's sitting over there. He doesn't need an introduction. People in literary circles here know him very well. He is the founder of Word Forward and a literary pioneer. And this session will be handled by Dr. Singh. So over to you, Dr. Singh. I'll just be monitoring here, looking for comments from you. Please do like and share and comment as much as you can. Call your friends. This is going to be a memorable session, and we are going to have a lot of fun and some knowledge and insights into the poetry of Neil Daswani. Over to you, Dr. Singh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zafar.
Thanks to the Singapore Book Publishers Association for making this online platform available, and it's a real pleasure to be here with Neil today, and to have actually read your recent book, Why Now? It kind of seems to cover a lot of territory. There's travel aspects to it. You deal with literature, your sources of you source different cultural kinds of art.
Mm-hmm.
There's history, there's mythology, and basically an underlying philosophy. So it seems to straddle cultures. Even your own name seems to straddle cultures. Neil Daswani.
Indeed.
So perhaps you could tell us a bit about yourself.
Thanks, Chris. No, happy to do that. And I've more recently, being over the past 12 months, adopted a tagline, which is sort of like a banker by day and a poet by night. But I'm not suggesting by any means that those are two schizophrenic existences. I mean, you only have to name T.S. Eliot, who is by far the best example of those two worlds being able to coexist quite happily. In terms of the name itself, it's got a little bit of a backstory. I come from a family, both my parents are professors of English literature and linguistics, and I was named by my mother, the Christian name. It's not really a Christian name, but you would refer to it as a Christian name. But I was named after Eugene O'Neill, the Irish-American author, and she was doing a dissertation on The Iceman Cometh at the time. So I guess that's part of the origin. And as the surname suggests, definitely of Indian origin, naturalized Singaporean. I've lived here since the year 2000, off and on. I've been outside of India for a large slice of my life. And most of my working career as a banker has been in areas such as the Middle East, certainly North Asia, Hong Kong, China, Korea, and that does feed through in a lot of my poetry, and it does inform what I write. Deep interest in mythology, which you've already referenced, and that does sort of come through in the poetry.
It's your title is intriguing. I mean, it's a question.
Yeah.
And I guess during this period of the pandemic that we're all experiencing, we've all got questions.
Yeah.
Why now? Seems to suggest has a lot of different resonances on different levels. I mean, reading through it, obviously there's that poem that you use as a title for the collection, kind of references the day-to-day mundane things that we have to do in our work lives.
Yeah.
But it also asks questions of deeper nature, sort of pursuing that kind of like Rosetta Stone of understanding, that
Mm-hmm.
level of
Mm-hmm.
of questioning. So, but how does a banker become a poet?
I think I've always been a bit of a poet. I think I probably mothballed it and put it away for a while. And it's interesting. We all sort of enter various careers. My parents went into academia and stayed there all their lives. I chose to possibly disappoint them in the short run, but a bit of a homecoming over the past 12 months in terms of outturning 4 books of poetry. But when we enter whatever occupation or profession we opt for or choose, I think we sort of burnish our CVs or biodatas, and they're full of things like elocution and debate and drama. And I was no different. But then got sucked into the routine of earning a living. And I did write over the years, over the sort of 35 years of being a banker. I did write, but more often than not, Chris, that was spurred by moments of tragedy in my life, moments of grief. And there are a few poems we can perhaps come to a little bit later in the conversation, which were deeply personal. But I wasn't writing that regularly, whereas up till the point in time where I entered the workforce, I was, like many young men at that stage and age of their lives, did write a lot in college and in high school, and probably somewhat poorly, although a lot of that has now found its way into my 3rd book called Red Shift, and that was quite a courageous moment to sort of air the dirty linen, so to speak, but I did that. So I came back to it, and I think there's that aspect of that 19-year-old or 20-year-old always being around and sort of tapping you on your shoulder to say, look, I'm here. I haven't run away. And I think the why now, it connects very nicely with that why now question in terms of, so I haven't gone away. And I think for me, the COVID-19 pandemic, personally, Chris gave me a few more hours because there was no commute time. We all had to sort of adjust to what everyone describes as working from home. And I guess it sort of begs the question, was that working from home or living in office? And the lines kind of got blurred. And I think, oddly enough for me, pouring myself back into something that was natural to me 30 years ago kept me afloat, sort of brought back that sanity, which otherwise would have been that blur between living in office and working from home. And it sort of was a little bit of a ballast that I could use to balance out the day. And I think that's what kind of happened over a period of the last 12 months. But it is a bigger question, and some of these are sort of, if you will, an aggregate of collections, which aggregate of questions, which probably just don't go away. They're the difficult ones. They won't go away, and they keep nagging at you. And I suppose the summary of all of that, if you wanted to distill it, was the realization that all that we really ever have is now. And I'm sort of sounding perhaps Eckhart Tolle in saying that, but there is that aspect. And I think being confronted with one's own mortality, and there were lots of incidents around all of us. And I think it was a time where humanity overall, everyone that you meet, had experienced loss or certainly had to re-index or rearrange their worldview. And I suspect I was no different.
Perhaps you can read that poem.
Yeah.
Right now. I think it'll be good to kind of, before we proceed further, let's hear about this, because you're talking about work life and life. Small L, big life.
Yeah.
Perhaps. Anyway, I'll say no more.
Yeah, but I'll perhaps come back to that point. It's a very interesting point. So why now? And I'll give you a bit of the backstory. This was actually written for my boss, somebody who'd been my boss for almost a decade. And she, like me, was a banker. And this was written at her retirement. But she was also possibly a concert-level violinist, or nearly became that. And similar to me, a little bit of similarity in those stories. An interest in humanities, arts, the performing arts, and then moving into something which was obviously very routine and required a different set of skills. But it's written in column poetry, so I'll read the first column, Why? And if you can think of this very successful leader, and there were two questions always on her mind. Why? Which was trying to get to the bottom of things, and now, which was obviously demanding that things be done quickly. So there's also a little bit of wordplay there, if you will, Chris. So why? Why work your fingers to the bone, your nose to the grindstone? There you go, dotting every I, crossing every T, leaving no stone unturned. Sometimes casting stones against the wind, blown away just beyond your grasp, seeking the keystone to the arch. Now that you have all the answers, save the last why. Coming to the second column, now. Now that you've hung up your fiddle, trust yourself. Your nose knows when a period is an end. Till you stand at the final fork, there's no turning back. The answer lies a stone's throw away, striving, falling short of perfection, reaching for the Rosetta in the rubble. You've changed all the questions, like you always do. Now? So it reads quite well horizontally as well, but I think there was that aspect of, yes, here was somebody at a crossroads, but equally it would apply even when you're in this midst of, and I hear this phrase work-life coming back to your opening gambit, and I'd like to sort of think of it more in terms of work-home/family, because work is so much a part of all of our lives. So the distinction between work and life perhaps falls away, particularly in this living in office, working from home blur that I mentioned earlier.
I mean, the poem
Yeah.
addresses the question, but it doesn't really attempt to answer it, because there's no real answer, is there?
That's especially the closing lines of what I just read out. Just as you thought you had all the answers, they changed all the questions. And that's perhaps, Chris, as we discover it, the very nature of poetry. There is no finality. There is no line that you draw at the end of the stanza, and that's it. And perhaps there's always something unfinished, and therefore, but the beauty lies in that imperfection, or the lack of finality, if you will.
I mean, poetry is not mathematical in that sense, with a final equation and an answer to it. And it seems that we are in this particular phase at the moment, still going through this COVID-19 pandemic throughout the world. We've all been locked down for periods. Now we're a little freer, but not totally free. It's interesting. You've addressed COVID in a couple of the poems in particular. Obviously, that's been part of all of our experience. But I was interested to see that in one of the poems in the poem novel Corona, that you actually demonize the virus, and you call it, a shadow king. And it struck me that that was quite similar to a lot of the mythologically focused poems in the book.
Right.
So I wanted to see if you would like to talk about how you use myth, and whether you think myth today is an appropriate way to deal with contemporary things like COVID that we're going through. Maybe you'd like to compare a couple of poems in that regard.
No, thanks, Chris. That's very insightful, and indeed, mythology has influenced my work in myth and fantasy. So there, the novel Corona, there's almost a likening to, the Shadow King in Mordor. So obviously, influences of being influenced by the Lord of the Rings, like many of us, come through in that. So perhaps just a few stanzas from that, and it begins that way. Corona, Corona, Shadow King with a ghastly crown. A tissue, he tries to get you to tumble down. Sneezing and wheezing, he will hunt you as his prey, grab you and choke you and suck your breath away. And it sort of goes on, the poem goes on to talk about, at the time, at the very outset, we did see some instances of poor behavior, but the poem also longs for a unity, a uniting of minds and hearts, and trying to come through this horrible crisis we're all going through. And towards the end, it isn't quite myth, but it goes back into nursery rhyme land, and husha, 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 we'll pin Corona to the ground. Again, the personification, and this, indeed the demonization. Then banish him forever, so he never comes back round. In the clear light of the morning, it will seem that he never was. That's when we'll all rejoice that we stood united behind a cause. So,
Is there another poem that's more directly also about mythology
Yeah, yeah.
that we can look at to compare and
Yeah.
contrast.
Yes, indeed. There's several in there. Let me choose one of them. And again, something that's been popularized by Hollywood and, in this case, I think Marvel, but Ragnarok. And those of us who've seen the Thor series, pretty much all of us, I imagine, will relate to that. So it's a modern rendering of that, but the landscape and its reflection. So if you think of a Viking ship, the landscape and its reflection in the water are both tethered, held fast by a cord, thicker in shadow than it really is, thicker in shadow than it really is, penumbra. Meanwhile, I sit asleep on the bench till some inebriated goon knocks me senseless, swinging a bottle and a prayer at the prow. They will fold my arms, Viking style, across my chest. I will carry with me my hammer and perhaps my stirrup and anvil, so I will remember the words, the secret incantation that the old man whispers in my ear softly, so softly, that only I can hear.
So mythology via the movies.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. And of course, that's a reference to Odin whispering in dead Balder's ear. And nobody knows. Throughout Norse mythology, that word that he whispers is unknown. It's not quite, they talk perhaps of rebirth, they talk, and obviously there's an element of hope, and linked to the whole COVID-19 crisis, and there is a linkage there. There is hope, and perhaps, going back to that Odin and Balder moment, I suppose.
Yeah, somebody just commented online about the Nordic mythology part.
Yeah.
That they love it, and if you have more poems in that space, probably you can share.
But there's a very short one.
Sure.
There's a very short one, which we'll ask for that one. It's called "The Son of Odin," so that's Thor all over again.
So this is a request.
It's a request. Well, thank you, whoever made the request, and I imagine you liked it. So here you go. It's called "The Son of Odin." You speak in sudden thunderclaps. We had fair warning. The sentences of forked lightning that streaked across the sky, turning trees to twigs in your whetstone wrath. So this is that great battle between Thor and the giant Hrungnir. And actually, kids in Scandinavia, even to this day, told not to, sort of accidentally drop a stool on the floor, because that's going to give Thor a headache, because he's got a wedge of that giant's axe buried in his head. And, well, that's the myth.
It's quite fascinating. I noticed that a lot of the poems also kind of explore opposites. You work in a sort of using that kind of literary technique which we call parallelism.
Yeah.
So you have this versus that.
Yeah.
That seems to be reflected when you're talking about perhaps Chinese Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, that kind of triumvirate of Chinese philosophies, East Asian philosophies that permeated the region. So there are poems like "No Such Thing as Silence" and "Water, the Shape of Things." Even the Thanksgiving poem, which maybe we'll get to later, where you kind of use these opposites to juxtapose kind of points of view. Is it?
Yeah.
What is your purpose in doing that? Like for example, in the Thanksgiving poem, I noted the lines like "the prey and the predators, the reporters and editors." You have this, you're setting up this litany of responses, which is really quite fascinating. Can you tell us a bit about this part of your writing?
Yeah. I don't want to overcook it or over-egg it, Chris, but I think part of it comes quite, in a cultural sense, from deep within. And whether you're talking about Buddhist philosophy, which I did grow up reading, and I come from a family of theosophists, so whether it's Taoism or Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, I was fortunate enough not to be spiritually exposed at a very young, impressionable age as a teenager, but was never made to be ritualistic. And I think I'm very grateful to my parents and my uncles and aunts at the time, who weren't doctrinaire, if you will, or there was nothing dogmatic about their approach. And that allowed me that freedom of duality, to recognize that through duality, you perhaps try and experience or appreciate even a state of water, the stillness of it, the tranquility of water, but equally the fierce, wild magic of water as well. And we can perhaps come to that. And in a way,
Would you like to read it?
Yeah, it's an ecological poem in a sense, but perhaps the only one I've written. My wife, if she were here, would say that I need to be more mindful about how much water I'm using while I'm showering. But water, the shape of things to come. So this is how it goes. Fickle and faithless, never ever constant, water throwing out shapes as it dances, embracing emptiness of all shapes and sizes, a vassal to all vacuum, replete in reservoirs, lying listless in lakes. Water can lick itself back into shape by cascading through canyons and gushing through gorges, rivers that rapidly rush back to the mothership of the sea. But water also shapes things. Centuries of chipping away, water torture, dripping onto rocks. Or a sudden tsunami surge, shaking its fist at the sky, consuming cities and citadels, water marking an epoch where the ice in its veins matches the permafrost in its heart. Or just evaporating into vaporware, like some cheap magic, poof, and it's gone, sucked up by the yellow sponge in the sky, something we will miss when all the wells run dry, the shape of things to come.
As water is, it flows quite well, that poem.
Thank you.
As water does, rather.
As water does, yes. Finds its own level. Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask a question about poets and poetry and form.
Yeah.
There seems to be quite a good deal of use of traditional meter and also rhyme in your work.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be quite strongly part of the fabric of what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also struck by that you do have certain translations from Chinese and Korean.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of Ezra Pound, who really promoted the idea of he tried to, in a sense, convince kind of the readers of his day that Chinese poetry does not rhyme and does not have meter, which is actually totally incorrect.
Yeah.
But I noticed that when you kind of work in the field of translation, you do use rhyme and meter to depict or to try to represent those original works.
Yeah.
Perhaps you have something to illustrate it, and maybe you'd like to talk about your interest, because Korea also seems to figure in your work.
Yeah. Korea, China, and not in this body of work, but in a work that's going to be published later on this year, Japan as well. And I was just fortunate to be in that hub or epicenter of Hong Kong, and sort of having the opportunity to experience all of those cultures over a period of 4 years. But yeah, I think that was a bit of both. I think some of it was intuitive, that looking at the opportunity to translate, which was given to me by my Chinese colleagues, who brought, having read my plain English poetry, said, well, have you familiarized yourself with Chinese poetry? And not knowing Mandarin, I said no, but they spent a lot of time and effort in explaining in the English translation, which I then put to verse. But it was deliberate to keep the rhyme and meter. So that was a conscious decision. And if you will, it was classical meeting classical, although I wasn't fully aware of the Ezra Pound approach, which is quite interesting. I must really look into it a bit more, Chris. But that was a conscious effort. Especially there was one which wasn't a poem, it was just a single phrase, but I was very clear that I had to put that to meter and rhyme. And that's called Horsepower. And the single phrase, the English translation, is just that once a word is spoken, even a cart pulled by 4 horses can't chase it back. So it's about your word. And I've I've played around with it a little bit, and it goes like this. The promise that you've made is the promise that you must keep. Withstanding the horsepower of the four who gallop and leap and stretch and strain at the reins, you can feel their thrust. Don't go back on your word, for this is a matter of trust. But the bridle may break and the horses may win. As you break your promise, your world caves in. The last two lines are my take on the situation of, which expressed very tersely in the Chinese is, once a word is spoken, even a cart pulled by four horses can't chase it back into your mouth. You have given your word. But there I'm talking about breaking of a promise and the world, your world caving in. And there's almost, you're going back on your word. It's the opposite of that. So back to the exploration through opposites. So I picked up the original concept, but brought it to life, if you will, through the opposite.
Was it a Tang period
it is.
poem?
It
So it's
yeah,
about 8th
phrase.
century,
Yeah,
kind of AD, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Or BCE?
Yes.
CE. CE. To be politically correct.
Yes.
No, it's fascinating because obviously the poem shares kind of human experience that is universal and is still relevant today.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's quite clear listening to you that you also like performance and performing.
Yes.
Is that a sense of what poetry is for you? It's not just something that's on the page. Not to say that books are not important; they are definitely important.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that poets, more than prose writers, still like to believe the fact that the spoken word and their delivery of it is as important, perhaps, as the writing of it.
Certainly for me, Chris, I would nod my head to all of that. I think it's a virtuous circle. So the poem inspires the performance, which feeds the poem, if you will. And no one performance is identical to the previous. And I've noticed that as I go about it and get more familiar with my own words, if you will, and they land quite differently. And I'm interested in getting feedback from the audience. And I suppose that goes back to part of my high school training and inclination. I did a lot of theater in high school and college. Ended up doing a small role in an art movie as well, which we won't get into, and I'm not announcing the name. But yes.
Maybe there's a poem, like a poem that comes to my mind is Boots.
Yeah.
But also, Zafar, you might have some questions coming on the feed, so we can kind of, perhaps if you can read that.
I can maybe tell the backstory while you're looking for relevant questions.
Yeah,
then we
some
can
people
get
asking if the book is available in this country, that country. So
well, I'll leave that to you, Zafar.
Yeah,
I'm sure you're better versed than I am to answer those questions. So the backstory on Boots is, I believe it's an interesting one, Chris, and I do a lot of work with Korean artists, and I write poetry in response. And there's another book called Seen and Felt, subject for another day. But I do a lot of work with Korean artists, and this was not one of the artists I've collaborated with. More of an amateur artist who'd lost her husband. And for 4 years, this artist had neither picked up a brush nor a pencil, not drawn or sketched or painted at all. And then one day, sort of after a gap of close to 4 years, she came across her deceased husband's boots. And that must have sparked something in her. And taking up a brush, she sketched it and then painted it in. And it's a painting of his battered old work boots. And so for me as a poet, when I got to see the painting, it represented an opportunity at various levels, literally putting myself in the shoes of this artist, but also trying to think of what she might be going through, looking at the boots, which were in a way a metaphor for a life journey. The daily trudge, the routines we all go through, and the boots sort of played to that theme. And then, obviously, to make it deeply personal, I had my father continues to this very day, at the ripe old age of 85, be very prim and proper, and he knew a lot about shoes and boots. And I learned a lot about shoes every time I went to a shoe store, and I was pointed out by him at the various models on the shelves, etc. So I used a lot of phrases and references that describe boots, and I would encourage. There are a few double entendres there and references, and if the audience were to listen carefully, they'll pick those up. So it is one of my favorite poems. So thank you for choosing that one. Boots. Down at heel, these tired twins have seen better days. Buff and burnish, spit and polish, they never felt the pinch. Accomplices to your tiptoed tread towards the threshold of each morn, Springer spaniels to your stride as you slipped out the gates of dawn, shock absorbers that tramped through your day, through the mindless march, the senseless slog, trusted footmen that you put away when you walked back through the doors of dusk. These seams held both weld and vamp, kept your toes from the cold and damp, took you through sludge and slush, through puddled pavements and mush, sturdy stalkers at the final ramp when you chose to opt out of the rush. Scarred and scuffed at the toe when once in an unseemly rage you lashed out at a can, only to kick it farther down the road. Now bruised and battered, these jaded journeymen stare back at me with faded knowing eyes. Broken aglets that have got no spare, unraveled laces that run threadbare, strands that have grown too long to an old orange ochre, a hair dye gone all wrong. Sitting awkward and alone, tongue-tied and soul-weary, pigeon-toed and ingrown, once garrulous, now leery. If only they would speak to me, I'd even take their monologue, whisper to me in varied tones, orate in ostentatious Oxford, blast me with your basic brogue. At night I try and slip into your shoes, as if to fill some cavity in me. I'll walk in them for a while. I planned on doing 20 leagues, when with a sudden jerk I'll pull up at the mile. I'll have to abandon this intrigue. I know I cannot step into your boots. I'm just pretending that I can.
Yes, I think we've all been there. It's interesting, despite all the fact that you've got a lot of kind of allusions to literature, to mythology, history, and so on, it seems that a subject like boots, which is very, in a sense, mundane, very ordinary, still has a lot of depth of feeling there. That seems to be something that poets tend to be able to pull off, because I think it's because of technique, perhaps. And in a sense, how do you feel about poets and talking and writing that their writing is as much about the way of saying it as opposed to what's being said?
It's a really interesting point you make, Chris, because it's almost sort of, to my mind, breathing life into something that's inanimate, and that obviously comes through the wordplay, the juxtaposition, and in this case, using terminology that belongs to the world of shoes, and I try and use that. Ostentatious Oxford. Oxford is a make of shoe, as is blast me with your basic brogue, and you almost have to sort of study the subject, but do it through emotion. So I think it's getting that balance right, understanding the field or the object, or in this case boots, but being able to breathe life into it through the emotive contrast.
I mean, it's quite clear that, for example, if you're writing fiction,
right,
immediately when people start to talk about and discuss what was written, they'll start talking about character, plot. They tend to speak less about the metaphors that we used.
Right.
They may do, in passing, but whereas poetry is very much more about, as much as about the way of speaking as it is, what's being said. And I was reminded of the lines in that poem, Chen
Chonjiin. Yeah.
Chonjiin,
Yeah.
the Korean
Yes.
kind of poem.
Yeah.
And you have some lines that say, "Do all syllables turn to song as they head to the horizon?"
Yeah.
Now, I'm just curious because where is the starting point for you for writing a poem? Is it hearing a word, a phrase? Is it anecdotal for you?
Yeah. In this particular, the backstory of this was interesting. It was just a photograph of a lady sent by a very close friend of mine, sitting out on a beach on a bench. You can see the horizon. You've got the sea, then you've got the land, and back to the Taoist philosophy, and Shunjiyin is actually exactly that. You've got heaven, earth, and humanity, and if you look at the Korean alphabet, or the Hangula, that's what it is. It's a series of vertical, horizontal, and dots. And the dots being the stars, the horizontal being the earth, and the vertical being the connector, which is mankind. So that's, and for me, the real connector actually was my background. So if you read that poem, and perhaps if we've got time, we can delve into it a bit. It talks about syllables, vowels, consonants, and that's sort of, if you will, part of my legacy. I grew up at a dinner table where it was quite common to talk about syntax and semantics, and I never thought I'd ever come back to it. I ran as far away from it as I could at one stage of my life, but here I am, sort of, 35 years later, soaked into what obviously I learned through perhaps sheer osmosis. Well, the sanctified syllables, and that's kind of how the poem ends. Perhaps we've perhaps we've whetted the reader's appetite. So Shunjiin. The earth touches the sky hesitantly at the horizon, sometimes through the sea, where the sun is either set or has not yet risen. As mere humans, our feet are firmly grounded by gravity. All men are mortal. Pulled through the cycles and four seasons by the ballet of the earth as it tiptoes around the stars and the sky. What do we humans have but words? Whimsical whispers, convivial and coaxing, amounting maybe to nothing, muttered monosyllables, subsumed by speechless silence. Unlike the sea that can retract and recoil on itself, words shouted out in the high tide of our anger echo out loudly long after the madness has ebbed away. What then of the words sentenced to suffocate in the trachea of our trauma? The tenderness we never quite got our tongues around, throttled in our throats, unuttered and unsaid? Like that last gasp before you were gone. Do all syllables turn to song as they head to the horizon? Does each echo listen out for the sound it will claim back as its own? No vowel vanishes, no consonant is consumed. The sanctified syllables are the alphabet soup that we now drown our sorrows in.
There's also, I'm thinking, my mind is going toward the idea of meditation,
Yes.
the use of mantra, the
Yeah.
use of evoking, as you say, sacred syllables.
Yes.
Yes. Do you meditate?
I used to a lot. As I said, I grew up in a household where there were lots of theosophists and simple ones. Just the mindfulness of breathing, which is a very simple mindfulness routine, and the meditation around compassion links back to the earlier part of our conversation, and actually is expressed in the final stanzas of novel Corona as well, in that having that compassion, starting with compassion for yourself, but then fanning out ripple pool-like series of eddies into the toughest bit, where you have compassion for someone who's wronged you, and that isn't always easy.
It's a good time to practice Buddhism during COVID, is it?
I would say so. It's been a curious time, Chris, and other than just sort of discovering time and space to do things that are important, and every one of us, I think, has. But whatever sort of worldview or what your belief system is, and I think we've all sort of returned or recalibrated those belief systems over these past 12 months. I certainly have. So.
Now, the book also struck some serious notes, obviously.
Yeah.
There are even kind of post-obituaries here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've noticed that even from all of the poems that you have shared so far tonight, tonight, I'm quite aware that you use metaphor very well. Your poems think their way toward their conclusions. They're not just purely anecdotal, though you have written those sort of poems as well.
Yeah.
But a poem, like the year,
a year on,
seems to have a central metaphor of playing cards. The person was a card player,
right?
And then you, in fact, refer to the shuffling, shuffling of our cards of our life, so to speak, at the end.
Indeed.
Perhaps you could share that.
Yeah, it's a longish poem, so perhaps a few relevant stanzas. Now, a bit of the backstory for the audience. That's actually a eulogy, and as the title suggests, a year on. It was written a year after my mother-in-law passed away, and like a good daughter, a key interest at the time was playing cards and or mahjong as well. And so she lived in what in India is called a hill station, and a lot of the activities around that. Let me just find the poem. Yes, it's right here. A year on. So perhaps I'll read the first few stanzas to give you a sense of the person. And as Chris has said, it is an obituary, and I'm trying to move beyond an obituary, and I'll get to that part, and then we'll perhaps segue into the end, because it is fairly long. A year on. A year on, the obituary we should have crafted for you back then, but in our still recent grief did not. Would surely have mentioned, perhaps a bit irrelevantly, your fondness for cards. A mere listing of survivors, loving husband, kids, grandkids, numerous nephews and nieces would not have been nearly enough for the chance readers to picture the glee on your face when you declared Andromic, or for them to see or imagine they'd seen the covert side looks from fellow players when in later years, like an aging boxer who'd lowered the guard, there would be a tremble to your firm fan grip. This then speaks to the inadequacy of obituaries, those two-dimensional tablets that are only opaque windows on our lives. Their thick, bold borders seeking to contain a maze of memories to a word count and fostering much debate around font and style. And it goes on, as Chris had indicated, to talk again. It returns to the central theme of the card playing, and a year on, we smilingly recall your love for cards. One for each week that has slowly passed. So yet and yet we shuffle our way through our lives, arranging things into neat rows, occasionally discarding them into this ever-growing heap. So,
I think that this is what poets do well. They take things like metaphor, extend them, and use those as a framework to think and feel their way towards some understanding of a situation or a person. It's definitely a talent that poets have. I'm not saying that prose writers don't have it. They do, of course. They, prose writers, and I am also a prose writer too.
Yes,
so
indeed.
I have to put on my poet's cap one day and my prose writer cap another day. Turban, rather. But I find that poets are very much focused on kind of using that type of concentrated literary language, and then using that to express some, some deeper ideas. Now, it would be remiss of me to sort of say that your poems are not all dark. There are lots of light touches here.
Indeed.
I also notice that you have a narrative, a thread in your work. Poems like the Chiang Mai Masseuse and the Marmalade at 30,000
Indeed.
feet, whatever.
Yes, 30,000.
They seem to be kind of fun, parts of the book as well.
Yeah. All right. We can certainly have a bit of fun. Yes, there've been a few somber, heavy themes. There are very light ones as well. And a little bit of a backstory on Chiang Mai masseuse. Despite having lived in Asia for as long as I have, I haven't really experienced, foot reflexology or the massage, which is very much a part of life here. And so on a recent trip to Chiang Mai, in fact, that's probably the last trip I did before COVID shut us down, shut travel down anyway. And it was in Chiang Mai, and I was persuaded to sit alongside the wife who was getting a foot massage, and I got mine as well. So Chiang Mai masseuse. And so whilst this foot massage was happening, I was actually in my head writing this poem, and no sooner had we got back to the hotel, I scribbled it furiously because I was afraid I might lose some of the tempo and rhythm. And as Chris has said, a lot of, and this poem in particular will bring that out, the meter, the rhyme, and the rhythm was kind of like a drum beat in my head. So here goes. Chiang Mai masseuse. She thumbs through the directory of my feet, confirmed I'm flat-footed, not an athlete. Her fingers probe for where they are weak. My bunions and corns play hide and seek. Charts her course through calluses and cracks, plans her next move, then mounts her attack. Her knuckles knead away at a gnarly knot till she comes across the tendermost spot. My foot loses all its sense of touch and feel when her lathe assaults the spurs in my heel. Clenched teeth cage the rictus of my scream. Her eyes smile at me in an assassin's gleam. Her wrists clamp both my feet in a cinch. I tell myself, you will not so much as flinch. Then her healing hands begin to transfer calm. For good measure, she rubs in some oily balm. Knick-knack, paddywhack, slow and deep. Much more than just my foot went to sleep. When it was over, she gave my foot a pat, stood up and bowed, and that was that. Yes, light-hearted, as you said, and I quite enjoyed writing that one.
You said that you write a lot on planes.
I do. I used to, one of the roles I had was looking at markets outside of Asia, and that involved a lot of long-haul flights to the UK and the US. And on one such flight, just before we were landing into Heathrow Airport, they served breakfast. And after a long flight, and I sort of, getting on in age and all of that, I wasn't quite as adept at various things as I might have been several years ago. So I'm trying to find the poem. It should be somewhere. Yeah. So this is called Marmalade at 30,000. And for those of the audience who've bought the book, and those of you who might, it's actually mentioned in the testimonial on the back of the book cover. So quite clearly, the first few readers of this collection of poetry enjoyed this one. Marmalade at 30,000. My arthritic wrist is showing its age. The gears in my hand won't engage. I take up my knife, a prize, a nudge. Damn jam jar lid just will not budge. I scrunch all my face into a fist to summon more power to my wrist when the steward, all smug and deft, condescendingly opens it with his left. So, bit of humor. And I wrote that on the back of a paper napkin or serviette, and I didn't keep it. I probably ought to have as a memento, but yeah, that was literally scribbled in 5 minutes as the incident unfolded.
All about technique.
Indeed, yeah, all about
as technique. Poetry is too,
as indeed,
in so many ways.
Yeah, probably
though it's not only about technique. You have to have something to say. Sure. Any final questions that are coming through the feed that you can throw in?
No, most of the questions were about where they can buy the books from.
Well, that's a healthy thing.
Well, that's
so. Yeah, I think they're enjoying the conversation a lot.
Well, thank you. Well, we certainly are. I think we're probably losing track of time, but
I think we are into the last 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So this last year, you've written a lot.
Yeah.
You know, COVID has been good for you.
COVID, there was a bit of a silver lining, called it a purple patch, and that might be the title of the next book, hint, hint. But Yes, I did discover, as I said earlier, a couple of hours on either end of my workday, and for me, Chris, it wasn't about. I've decided right, so you know, sitting in front of a blank sheet of paper and saying a lot of this had been written in the lead up to COVID. So what the pandemic. So a lot of what I did in the pandemic, thanks to Zafar, was to go through the mechanics of this, and I wasn't good at that at all. So some of it was fresh creative output for sure, but perhaps 15-20% of it had been written over in the preceding 2 or 3 years. So it was more the administration of an aggregation of bringing it together. And that's where the banker poet or sort of executive poet started to happen. Just sheer inertia had got in the way, or whatever it was, call it inertia, and it had never happened. I'd kind of had a body of work that could have, at least for sure, perhaps one, if not two, of the 4 books I've written could have been published earlier, but I didn't get round to it. And COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown gave me that opportunity. And but for the faith that folks like Zafar and others had in me, I probably wouldn't be here today. And backing an unknown author was a big leap of faith. So, just a big thank you from me. And Chris, equally, the fraternity has been kind and welcoming and always ready to give advice. And they've been generous with that. And that's something that has struck me. And I've just come across a whole different community and constituency. And I think my life's been enriched as a result. I'm just very thankful that.
So do you have a final poem?
Well, on that note, it's probably appropriate to read a poem called Thanksgiving. And Chris alluded to it a little bit in terms of talking about the law of opposites. And as I read out the poem, I would encourage the audience to listen out for the contrasting pairs, the opposites, because this is a performance poem, and it's curiously links back to an early childhood in upstate New York, where every year for the Thanksgiving pageant, so the title of the poem is Thanksgiving, I got the same role back then, 50 odd years ago. I was the Native American Indian dressed in loincloth, looking quite enviously at my far better dressed classmates who were in full gear, as Pilgrim Fathers. So you can imagine that little pageant scene, and that happened several years in a row, but here goes, Thanksgiving. To the pilgrims and the deep-rooted, the plunderers and the looted, to the half-naked and full-suited, the loud and the muted, to the inquisitors and the persecuted, the broken, the reconstituted, to the believers and the deluded, the extroverts and the secluded, to the heathens and the baptized, the in-crowd and the ostracized, to the novice and the canonized, the overlooked and the recognized, to the parishioners and the pontiffs, the Robin Hoods and the sheriffs, to the defendants and the plaintiffs, the aides and their bailiffs, to the generous and the miser, the foolish and the wiser, the serfs and the Kaiser, the advised and the advisor, the cautious and the careless, the skittish and the fearless, to the selfish and the selfless, the hirsute and the hairless, to the students and the proctors, the patients and the doctors, the audience and the actors, the employees and directors, to the traitors and the patriots, the locals and expatriates, to the helpers and employers, the bankers and the lawyers, to the prey and the predators, the reporters and the editors, to the electorate and the senators, the indebted and the creditors, to the elders and the youngsters, the sons and the daughters, to the maters and the paters, the brothers and the sisters, I say, whichever ship you've sailed on, whatever voyage you undertook, with tailwinds that favored or stormy gales that hindered, whether your course was linear or an odyssey of detours, be thankful, be grateful for the safe passage that you've had.
We can clap you on that one.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we can safely say that poetry is alive and well in Neil Daswani's hands.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your work with us today.
Thank you.
And
It's been marvelous. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, and I'll hand it over back to Zafar.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, and thank you, Neil. This was such an engaging session. I'm sure a lot of people whoever joined us enjoyed it, and the video will stay on Facebook page of Singapore Book Publisher Association. Please do check it out. And before we close, I really want to thank the good folks at the SBPA, and goguru.com.sg, the official bookstore for this live casting, for arranging this live casting session, this book launch. And most importantly, all of you out there who watched it and who stayed with us.
Thank you.
To share these moments, which are very special to all of us. Please do check out the book from goguru.com.sg, and don't forget to send your feedback over here or at Kitaab's online store or our website. Thank you very much once again, and hope to see you in another session another time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
The Singapore Book Publishers Association is celebrating UNESCO World Book and Copyright Day 2021 on the 23rd of April with a Book Bazaar promotion. The Book Bazaar will be held over a period of 10 days starting from the 23rd of April. This is a virtual book fair accompanied with programs curated for the consumers in mind. You can enjoy our fabulous book promotions, participate in our exciting webinars and book launches. Free audiobook and ebook and books to win is waiting for you. Hurry, visit bookbazaar.sg now.